What if myths of gods were historical records of the first civilization, full documentary? Beneath the shifting sands of forgotten continents, colossal cities vanish without a trace, their stones whispering secrets older than history itself. Across oceans and mountains, myths of gods, giants, and immortal rulers endure, hinting at beings whose power and knowledge shaped the earliest human societies. Could these tales be more than imagination, fragments of memory from a civilization lost to time, recorded as divine legend? From the towering titans of Greece to the feathered serpents of Mesoamerica, every story may carry a trace of reality. Step into this world where myth and history intertwine, and discover what humanity might have once truly known. The day the sky opened, high above the earliest human settlements, long before the invention of writing or the rise of the great river civilizations, people lifted their eyes to a sky that seemed alive with mystery and portent, recording through myth what they could not yet describe with measurement or theory. Archaeologists studying Upper Paleolithic sites such as Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, dated to roughly 25,000 years ago, have discovered carvings depicting elongated, radiant figures whose stylized forms bear uncanny similarity to the celestial beings later described in Sumerian, Dogon, and Hopi cosmologies. Anthropologists argue that such consistencies reflect patterns of cognitive symbolism, yet the extraordinary recurrence of descenders from the heavens may indicate that early humans attempted to preserve memories of rare encounters that left impressions profound enough to survive thousands of generations through oral tradition. Across the plains of ancient Mesopotamia, the earliest cuneiform tablets, some over 5,000 years old, describe the Anunnaki as beings who came from the sky to the earth, a phrase repeated with remarkable regularity in the lexical lists excavated at sites like Nippur and Kish. While scholars interpret these narratives as theological constructs, the linguistic structure of the Sumerian term An, UNNA, Ki, often translated as those who came from above, suggests a linguistic metaphor shaped by observations of celestial events, possibly including bright meteor trails or nocturnal fireballs recorded in later Babylonian astronomical diaries. Modern analyses of these tablets using multispectral imaging have revealed subtle variants of the same glyph cluster, indicating multiple scribal traditions attempting to articulate an idea that may predate writing itself. Within the traditions of the Dogon people of Mali, another thread emerges, linking celestial visitors to cosmological knowledge whose depth continues to puzzle researchers. Ethnographic studies, conducted throughout the 20th century, documented an intricate understanding of the Sirius star system, particularly the dense white dwarf Sirius B, whose existence was unknown to Western astronomy until Friedrich Bessel's calculations in 1844 and its direct observation in 1862. Although contemporary reassessments argue for possible cultural contamination, the Dogon's emphasis on a star invisible to the human eye that orbits every 50 years aligns strikingly with Sirius B's 50.1-year orbital period. Whether this knowledge developed through symbolic, ritualized observation or represents fragments of a much older intellectual inheritance remains an open question that invites speculation about how such cosmology might have been transmitted. Far across the world, in the highlands of the Andes, the Moche and Nazca civilizations depicted winged beings with radiant headdresses in murals and ceramics dated between 200 BCE and 600 CE. Archaeological pigment analyses performed on Moche friezes reveal the use of cinnabar-based vermilion and iron oxide blends to produce an intense red associated with divinity and descent, while isotopic studies of Nazca ceremonial dyes suggest long-distance trade networks moving materials across mountains and deserts. These material facts demonstrate the societal importance of celestial imagery, yet they also pose a deeper question. Why would cultures with no direct contact mirror each other's iconography of figures descending from the upper realms, unless some shared, profoundly archetypal motif was at play? Such cross-continental similarities provide fertile ground for interpreting myths of sky beings as memories refracted through geography, ecology, and time. In the ice-carved landscapes of prehistoric northern Europe, petroglyphs at sites such as Alta in Norway, dating back nearly 7,000 years, depict shimmering arcs and descending motifs, believed by some researchers to represent auroral displays during periods of high solar activity. Plasma physicists examining ice core data from Greenland have identified elevated beryllium-10 concentrations corresponding to massive solar storms during the mid-Holocene, suggesting that luminous, spiraling structures visible across latitudes may have inspired descriptions of fiery beings or serpent lights descending from the sky. These geophysical findings lend a scientific dimension to the myths of sky-born figures appearing with radiant halos, offering one possible naturalistic explanation that nonetheless fits gracefully into a speculative narrative of cosmic visitations remembered imperfectly over time. Across Southeast Asia, Khmer, Cham, and early Austronesian mythologies speak of apsaras, garudas, and other aerial beings whose appearances were associated with thunder, wind, or sudden upheaval. Excavations at Angkor Boré and Ok Eo, once centres of early maritime trade, have uncovered bronze and gold leaf iconography depicting elongated, airborne forms rendered with aerodynamic curves and feather-like plumes. Metallurgical analyses indicate sophisticated alloying techniques involving precise ratios of tin and copper, suggesting a level of craftsmanship that may have elevated these sky icons to symbols of technological or ritual significance. The persistence of such imagery across maritime Southeast Asia raises the possibility that these descending figures served as mnemonic devices encoding cosmological knowledge, navigational references, or mythic memories of ancestral migrations guided by celestial cues. In the vast oral histories of the Australian Aboriginal peoples, particularly within the Yolngu and Tiwi traditions, stories describe Wandjina and Pukamani sky spirits who descend to instruct humanity during periods of environmental transformation. Archaeologists studying rock shelters in the Kimberley region have dated Wandjina paintings to at least 3,800 years old, with some pigments containing hematite particles, whose microstructural degradation suggests even greater antiquity. These figures, depicted without mouths and framed by halos of radiant lines, have long been interpreted as spiritual archetypes. Yet the environmental context, marked by rapid shifts in monsoon patterns between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago, suggests that they may encode historical memories of climatic disruption and rare celestial phenomena, observed during periods of atmospheric instability. Such environmental data infuses these myths with new complexity, bridging cultural memory with paleo-environmental science. Across North America, the Hopi and Zuni recount the Kachinas, spirit beings who descend from the cloud realm to instruct and renew humanity during cyclical world ages. Anthropologists analysing Hopi ritual calendars have noted precise alignments with solstitial and equinoctial solar events, indicating an advanced understanding of seasonal astronomy embedded within the mythic cycles. Excavations at Pueblo Bonito and nearby great houses at Chaco Canyon reveal architectural alignments with major lunar standstills, suggesting that ancestral peoples encoded celestial descent within architectural grammar. These alignments, verified using GPS surveying and archaeoastronomical modelling, reinforce the idea that stories of sky beings were intertwined with observational astronomy, cultural resilience, and the precise tracking of celestial cycles over centuries. When all these traditions are viewed together, Mesopotamian, Dogon, Moche, Nazca, Altaic, Khmer, Aboriginal, Hopi, a mosaic begins to emerge, one in which the sky is not merely a metaphorical realm, but a repository of memory, a canvas onto which ancient observers projected encounters, catastrophes, celestial events, and moments of awe that shaped their understanding of existence. The global recurrence of descending figures may represent convergent symbolism shaped by human neurology and environment. Yet, it may also represent a far older inheritance, a set of cultural memories preserved through oral tradition after the disappearance of a prehistoric society whose influence radiated across continents. And as these stories of sky beings unfold into more intricate accounts describing gods who fashioned humanity, the narrative begins to drift toward an even more provocative possibility, one in which the descent from the heavens was only the beginning of a much deeper legacy etched into the origins of our species, architects of the first humans. As the myths describing descending beings settle into an uneasy quiet, another kind of story begins to take shape, one not about travellers who arrived from the sky, but about what these figures were remembered to have done once they touched the earth, shaping humanity with a precision that reverberates across continents and millennia. In this slow turning of the narrative lens, creation myths no longer appear as isolated inventions of distant cultures, but as fragments of a broader memory system, one that suggests deliberate formation rather than spontaneous emergence. Embodied within their imagery is a vision of humanity handcrafted, not merely born, prompting the question of whether these stories are retellings of ancient metaphors or the symbolic residue of a civilization whose influence pressed itself onto the earliest chapters of our species. In the clay-rich river valleys of Mesopotamia, stories of gods moulding people from moist earth evoke not only poetic symbolism, but the possibility of cultural remembrances encoded in metaphor. The Enuma Elish and Atrahasis do more than describe deities at work. They paint scenes of assembly, design, and refinement, with each gesture of Enki or Nintu framed not as mystical magic, but as a form of skilled manipulation. In these narratives, the shaping of humanity unfolds like a sequence of procedural acts, and in their details lie echoes of a once structured understanding of how something complex could be created from something simple. From the highlands of the Andes, tales of deities forming humans from maize carry a resonance that transcends agricultural metaphor and leans towards structured experimentation remembered through agricultural symbolism. The creator Viracocha fashions beings in multiple attempts, each prototype exhibiting imperfections corrected in the next iteration, a process uncannily similar to early developmental refinement. Even if expressed through mythic imagery, the serial creation pattern suggests a memory of refinement, trial, and adaptation concepts familiar to engineers and artisans, but astonishingly consistent across ancient traditions. Through the sculpted figures emerging from early Anatolian sanctuaries, anatomical proportions appear exaggerated in ways that seem designed to emphasize specific traits rather than aesthetic preference. At sites such as Göbekli Tepe, human and semi-human forms bear outsized heads, sharply defined eyes, and stylized musculature, conveying an attention to features associated with cognition and strength. Whether these motifs merely reflect symbolic imagination or a deeper attempt to represent beings perceived as designers remains an open question, but the uniformity of these exaggerations gestures toward a shared cultural memory of observation, not invention. Across the genetic signatures that define our species, molecular timestamps reveal bursts of accelerated neurological development that resist easy explanation within traditional evolutionary pacing. The refinement of FOXP2, the expansions of cortical networks, and the sudden emergence of complex linguistic faculties appear in a time frame so compressed that it has long puzzled evolutionary biologists. These events, while fully within the natural realm, nonetheless form part of the scientific backdrop that makes the what-if question compelling. Did early humans change that ancient myth reframed through the language of divine sculptors? Within the oral traditions of Oceania, chants describing ancestral shaping ceremonies echo sequences that modern developmental biology maps in remarkable detail. Polynesian narratives recount how beings of light formed the first humans by layering elements bone, blood, breath in a stepwise choreography that mirrors embryological differentiation. Although such stories may be coincidental reflections of universal human intuition, their precision invites consideration of whether they preserve distant memories of a culture deeply attuned to the processes of biological development. Between the earliest symbolic artifacts, engraved ochres, geometric tablets, talismanic objects, lie cognitive patterns that imply guided leaps rather than incremental discoveries. Around 100,000 years ago, symbolic expression emerged simultaneously in multiple regions, as though ignited by an external spark or transmitted through a cultural conduit whose origin is no longer clearly visible. These artifacts bear witness to a coordinated awakening of cognition, a moment when the human mind began to encode abstraction, identity, and narrative with unexpected sophistication. Beneath the recurring motifs of breath-giving, clay-moulding, and bone-shaping deities, the cross-continental consistency suggests a shared inheritance rather than separate invention. Cultures separated by oceans and epochs echo the same structural motifs. Beings who knead, sculpt, assemble, or animate the first humans in acts that resemble craftsmanship more than miracle. This global spread tempts the imagination to consider whether these tales originated in a prehistoric society whose influence diffused outward, leaving behind only symbolic impressions of its knowledge. Through comparative linguistics, the abrupt emergence of structured grammar across unrelated regions raises questions about whether consciousness itself was shaped by forces not yet fully understood. Language, appearing not as a slow accretion of grunts and gestures, but as an explosion of syntactic complexity, suggests an underlying catalyst, cultural or cognitive, that transformed communication into an architectural force. In this view, myths of gods giving humans speech may encode recollections of a societal shift so profound it could only be framed as divine. As the narrative returns to the myths themselves, the portrayal of gods as artisans rather than rulers takes on new depth within the what-if lens. These creator figures are remembered not primarily as sovereigns, but as skilled shapers engaged in deliberate acts of construction, refinement, and transmission of identity. Such portrayals align more closely with the memory of a creator culture than with spontaneous, supernatural invention. From the convergence of anthropology, genetics, mythic structure, and archaeological patterning, a more daring possibility begins to rise, one in which the earliest humans were shaped not by celestial beings in the literal sense, but by a prehistoric society whose understanding of environment, biology, and culture allowed it to imprint itself upon nascent humanity. This notion requires no violation of natural law. Rather, it reframes myth as symbolic testimony to acts of cultural or developmental guidance refracted through millennia of memory and metaphor. And in the quiet that follows this contemplation, the creator myths reveal themselves not as static stories, but as veiled records of influence. As if humanity carries within its oldest narratives the fingerprints of those who once shaped its trajectory, preparing the way for the next mystery concealed within ancient tradition. As we reflect on these images of crafting and formation, the question naturally shifts toward what came next, because from the crafting of humanity, we move into the myths that describe the knowledge these gods imparted. Bringers of civilization, in the unfolding quiet left by the myths of humanity's formation, stories of instruction begin to rise, like dawn breaking over newly awakened minds, suggesting that creation alone was never the end of the tale, but instead the starting point for a deeper endowment that shaped the first scaffolding of human culture. Across continents, among peoples separated by oceans and epochs, myths describe divine figures stepping beyond the act of crafting bodies and choosing instead to cultivate minds, imparting structures of knowledge that would anchor human societies for millennia. And if these narratives preserve even fragmented echoes of prehistoric contact with a society already familiar with agriculture, language, astronomy, and governance, then the earliest steps towards civilization may not have been stumbled upon through accident, but guided by hands that understood what humans would someday need. Across the earliest linguistic strata, the sudden appearance of structured grammar suggests a moment when communication transformed into an intentional system rather than an instinctive exchange. A developmental leap visible in reconstructions of proto-languages, such as Proto-Afroasiatic, Proto-Indo-European, and Proto-Sino-Tibetan. Linguists have long noted that grammatical complexity tends to arise swiftly within communal contexts under strong selective pressures, but what remains astonishing is how similar structural innovations, cases, tenses, and hierarchical syntax appear in societies with minimal archaeological evidence of long-term isolation or gradual build-up. What if thinking invites the provocative possibility that such complexity was catalyzed by cultural diffusion from a group already fluent in structured linguistic systems, leaving behind roots that later blossomed into the vast linguistic diversity of the modern world? Within the archaeobotanical layers of the Fertile Crescent, the domestication of wheat and barley emerges with a rapidity that implies guidance from a source already fluent in cultivation, because the transition from wild einkorn to stable high-yield varieties occurs far faster than typical domestication curves. Studies of charred seeds from early Neolithic layers in sites such as Abu Huraira and Jerf el Amar show selection pressures so strong and so targeted that they resemble managed experimentation rather than passive gathering. This sudden agricultural proficiency mirrors myths in which gods descend to teach humanity how to sow, irrigate, and harvest, Thoth in Egypt, Enki in Sumer, and various maize-bearing deities in Mesoamerica, raising the question of whether these cultural memories encode early contact with agronomically advanced communities. Through the terraces of the Nile Valley, tools recovered from early settlements reveal standardized techniques that point to an underlying pedagogical tradition, as the uniformity of flint blades, grinding stones, and early sickles indicates a shared instructional lineage rather than dispersed evolutionary invention. Archaeologists note that such standardization usually emerges in societies with established apprenticeships or centralized knowledge hubs, structures that do not fully align with the presumed simplicity of early Neolithic communities. Yet mythic stories of divine instructors who offered humanity the tools of survival align intriguingly with this pattern, suggesting that the earliest farmers may have received demonstrations rather than relying solely on intuition. Along the horizon lines of ancient observatories, the placement of stones and sightlines demonstrates an astronomical precision far exceeding what small, isolated communities should have developed independently, especially when considering alignments at Mnajdra, Nabta Playa, and Chanquillo. These structures show awareness of solar cycles, solstitial extremes, and, in some cases, long-term precessional movements that require repeated observations across generations. If such knowledge entered these societies as gifts from mythological sky beings, figures like Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, and the Apkallu, it may reflect transmission of celestial mapping traditions originating from a culture that had already mastered systematic sky study. Within the earliest tablets of Sumer, the structure of early legal systems displays an unexpected coherence, as though shaped by a template rather than trial and error evolution, since even the earliest codes include proportional justice, property rules, marriage regulations, and inheritance protocols. Anthropologists studying the development of legal orders argue that such complexity usually arises only in societies with long histories of social stratification. Yet the myths surrounding the Code of Ur-Nammu and the Tablets of Enki describe divine origins for law itself, portraying these systems as structured frameworks handed to humanity at once, rather than slowly built across centuries. From the ritual narratives of the Aegean world, depictions of divine instructors show recurring motifs of beings teaching humanity to count, measure, and record, and such stories reflect a broader Eurasian tradition in which numbers and calendars are viewed not as inventions but revelations. Early tablets from Crete, Anatolia, and Cyprus demonstrate an abrupt shift from symbolic markings to coherent accounting systems using standardized numerical signs. Such leaps in representational thinking further fuel the what-if premise that these innovations may have been absorbed from an external source with an existing tradition of bookkeeping. In the agricultural myths of Mesoamerica, the maize-bearing deities function as symbolic channels for the transmission of techniques whose origins remain archaeologically elusive, because the genetic complexity of early maize points to a selective process that would have required sustained cultivation expertise. Zea maize underwent such a dramatic genetic transformation from its wild ancestor, Teosinte, that botanists still debate how early cultivators achieved it. The mythic narratives of divine teachers bringing maize from the celestial or subterranean realm may thus reflect cultural efforts to explain an encounter with a group already knowledgeable in intensive crop engineering. Through comparative patterns in material culture, the diffusion of identical innovations across vast distances hints at a shared source of knowledge rather than isolated invention, especially when the same architectural motifs, ritual symbols, or agricultural techniques appear in regions with minimal evidence of direct contact. Theoretical models in cultural evolution show that such convergence is statistically rare without strong migratory or instructional connections. When these parallel developments are compared alongside myths of culture-bearing gods, the possibility of a prehistoric society distributing a knowledge package becomes an intriguing speculative lens. In the earliest navigational traditions, descriptions of star path instructors suggest that seafaring expertise may have been seeded by societies already adept at celestial mapping, especially given the precision of Polynesian star compasses and Arabian desert navigation systems. Ethnographers studying these traditions note the presence of identical star catalogues in distant cultures, implying that their intellectual roots extend deeper than local development alone. Mythic figures who emerged from the sea or sky to teach navigation may thus preserve cultural memories of maritime experts who carried sophisticated knowledge through ancient trade networks. Throughout the tapestry of global myth, gods appear as teachers with an intensity rarely seen in purely supernatural creation tales, suggesting that the stories may function as mnemonic vessels designed to preserve the identity of forgotten teachers. This reverence for instruction aligns with archaeological findings showing that the earliest cities, Uruk, Çatalhöyük, Karal, develop around centers of ritual and learning rather than mere economic exchange, implying that knowledge itself was perceived as a sacred inheritance. As the final echoes of these lessons reverberate through the archaeological and mythological record, the chapter's path gently curves toward the next enigma, allowing the imagery of bestowed wisdom to dissolve into the rising accounts of divine tools and powerful implements that appear in myths around the world, inviting the speculation that once humanity received knowledge, the next phase of contact may have involved the sharing of instruments capable of reshaping the world, the fires of the gods. When storms break over distant horizons, ancient storytellers imagine not just lightning and thunder, but divine instruments of unimaginable power. Across cultures, myths describe weapons that blaze with fire, shatter mountains, or descend from the sky with unstoppable force. These narratives, Greek thunderbolts, Vedic Vajras, Norse Mjolnir, and Mesoamerican luminous tools, share an intensity that surpasses ordinary observation, hinting at events or technologies whose memory survived only in myth. If these stories are not mere metaphors, they could encode the experiences of prehistoric societies that witnessed, or perhaps wielded, forces far beyond the ordinary, leaving their echoes in legend. Legends from Homer and the Vedas describe flying chariots pulsating with kinetic energy, suggesting that observers recorded extraordinary phenomena through narrative. In the Mahabharata, Vimanas streak across the sky, leaving luminous trails. Homer's Aegis and Zeus's thunderbolt strike with precision and devastation. While modern interpretations often lean toward literary or religious symbolism, the recurrent motif of airborne energy devices raises questions about possible historical experiences, advanced craft, mechanical experimentation, or atmospheric phenomena that inspired these stories. In Norse sagas, Mjolnir is not merely a weapon, but a concentrated symbol of force, delivered with precision, raising the possibility that such tales encode observations of advanced metallurgy or projectile technology. Scholars have noted that the repeated descriptions of Mjolnir's weight, speed, and destructive capability resemble not supernatural exaggeration alone, but the memory of tangible engineering principles, such as high-density metals, kinetic projectiles, or controlled explosive devices. Could these myths be distorted recollections of early energy manipulation technologies now lost to history? From Mesoamerican codices, Quetzal-feathered weapons and fire-spewing deities appear repeatedly, hinting at rituals or instruments that may have produced luminous or energetic effects. Codex Borgia and other pre-Columbian texts depict gods casting streams of fire or wielding objects that radiate energy, often accompanied by ritual ceremonies. Some of these depictions may represent dramatized retellings of pyrotechnic demonstrations, controlled combustion, or chemical reactions, preserved in narrative as both spectacle and sacred memory. Among African Sahel traditions, gods wield storms and fire, which may reflect not mythology alone, but practical understanding of controlled combustion and energy manipulation. Oral narratives of lightning-throwing deities or fire-bringers carry technical details, timing, direction, and intensity, implying that these communities observed or experimented with technologies that could harness natural forces. When combined with the African rock art showing energetic imagery, these myths suggest that prehistoric knowledge of fire, heat, and energy may have been more sophisticated than previously thought. Analyses of slag, vitrified structures, and unusually alloyed metals from prehistoric sites show the early human capacity to manipulate heat and force in ways that could inspire mythic recollections of divine implements. Vitrified forts in Europe, high-temperature kilns in Anatolia, and bronze artifacts with unusual composition demonstrate that humans could generate extreme temperatures and manipulate materials with precision. Stories of weapons forged by gods may therefore preserve the awe generated by early experiments in energy concentration, metallurgy, and controlled destruction. In the Iliad and Mahabharata, bolts of energy are described as wielded at will. Yet natural explanations, such as meteor airbursts or static discharge, could account for some of these perceptions. Observers of rare celestial phenomena, bolides exploding in the atmosphere, volcanic lightning, or auroral glows, may have recorded these events as divine attacks, later codified as weapons in human memory. The similarity of descriptions across continents implies a common cognitive processing of extreme events, potentially augmented by rare technological interventions from an advanced prehistoric society. Parallels between different continents suggest that stories of glowing, flying, or weaponized phenomena are not isolated imagination, but might preserve memories of rare technological events or practices. Greek, Indian, Mesoamerican, and African traditions all describe tools of fire, light, and kinetic force, often attributed to the same class of skyborn or seaborn gods. When viewed together, these myths could reflect either a shared environmental trigger, a cognitive pattern, or provocatively the influence of a prehistoric civilization capable of disseminating knowledge or artifacts across vast distances. Symbolism in art, from depictions of Zeus's lightning to Vedic Vimanas, often encodes principles of motion, light, and energy, which could reflect real experiences filtered through narrative imagination. Sculptures, reliefs, and ceremonial items frequently emphasize precision, trajectory, and radiance, indicating that early humans may have understood, observed, or experimented with principles that modern viewers recognize as protophysics or energy manipulation. Myths may thus serve as mnemonic devices, encoding lessons about these forces for generations. Ritual artifacts were sometimes designed to produce sparks, heat, or light, indicating that mythic stories may preserve lessons about early energetic manipulation. Fire starters, polished metals, ceremonial torches, and reflective surfaces could create luminous effects which were interpreted as divine intervention. These tangible tools, paired with narrative embellishment, might have left enduring impressions that evolved into stories of gods wielding lightning, fire, or flying implements. Finally, as these luminous weapons fade from human memory into legend, the myths guide us toward the domains of the deities themselves, suggesting that the tools and energy they wielded were inseparable from the places they inhabited. Temples, mountaintops, and hidden caverns, often described as divine residences, may preserve clues about where and how these implements were created or tested. The stories imply that the next layer of discovery lies not only in the tools themselves, but in the environments of their makers, inviting speculation about the physical spaces and technological sophistication of the first civilization, where knowledge, energy, and myth were inseparable. Cities of the immortals, rising above clouds and forests, the legendary peaks of Olympus, Asgard, and Tir na Nog evoke landscapes of both awe and strategic advantage. Myths describe these elevated domains as the homes of gods, yet when observed through a historical lens, they may reflect real settlements perched on high terrain. Mountains and hills offered natural fortification, commanding views, and defensible positions, making them ideal for early societies seeking protection from rival groups or environmental threats. The repeated motif of skybound or remote cities across cultures suggests a memory of ancient strongholds that inspired stories of divine habitation. Even today, these elevated regions retain an aura of mystery, as though the land itself remembers the presence of extraordinary civilizations. Ancient texts speak of Dilmun's shining lands, surrounded by water and brimming with fertility, hinting at an oasis-like settlement preserved in memory through myth. Archaeologists have identified early settlements along the Persian Gulf and other coastal regions that thrived due to abundant fresh water, arable land, and access to maritime trade routes. These features align with descriptions of Dilmun as a land of prosperity, where the gods dwelt and humanity first experienced abundance. Could the myth of Dilmun be an imaginative echo of a real, sophisticated settlement whose influence radiated across regions? Geological studies indicate that rising sea levels may have submerged portions of these settlements, perhaps giving rise to legends of lands lost to the waters. In Ireland and Scandinavia, sacred mounds and hilltop enclosures recall the enduring motifs of divine habitation, suggesting these myths may encode memories of real elevated settlements. Neolithic passage tombs, fortified hill forts, and ceremonial mounds reveal an advanced understanding of landscape and defense. The careful placement of these structures in commanding locations mirrors the way myths place divine cities in high or remote places, hinting that oral traditions preserved both geographical and cultural memory. Some sites even contain evidence of ritualized astronomy, showing an awareness of celestial cycles that may have influenced their symbolic importance. Geological surveys reveal that some of these high-altitude regions offered natural defenses, abundant water sources, and mineral wealth, which could explain why they became enshrined as sacred spaces. From the rocky slopes of Greece to the fjord-bound highlands of Scandinavia, terrain features provided practical advantages, from stone for construction to fresh springs for daily survival. These environmental attributes may have impressed early observers so deeply that they became woven into myths, elevating human settlements to the status of divine abodes. Volcanic soils, fertile valleys, and abundant timber further enhanced these areas, supporting large populations and sophisticated construction techniques that would have seemed miraculous to neighbouring communities. Aerial perspectives of ancient city ruins, terraces, and megalithic foundations show a level of planning and engineering that resonates with descriptions of immortal abodes. Terracing, stone fortifications, and complex layouts suggest societies capable of significant coordination, logistical planning, and long-term occupation. The scale and sophistication of these sites could have inspired tales of cities inhabited by beings far superior to ordinary humans, remembered in myths as immortal. In some regions, roads and water channels reveal advanced infrastructure, implying that these settlements were carefully organized and maintained, possibly influencing mythic narratives of divine perfection and abundance. Cultural continuity across continents implies that myths of celestial or elevated cities may reflect the collective memory of early urbanization or fortified centers rather than purely spiritual imagination. Greek Olympus, Norse Asgard, and Celtic Tir na Nog all emphasize height seclusion, and grandeur, hinting at shared cognitive patterns or, more intriguingly, preserved memories of real places where advanced groups lived. Even distant civilizations appear to encode similar structural characteristics in myth, suggesting either convergent imagination or the imprint of an influential prehistoric culture. Archaeological correlations between architectural techniques in disparate regions hint that these stories may preserve knowledge of engineering, resource management, and communal organization. Trade routes, resource hubs, and astronomical alignments in prehistoric sites align intriguingly with mythic accounts, hinting that the so-called gods may have been custodians of these networks. Many high settlements are situated near mineral veins, fertile valleys, or navigable rivers, indicating strategic planning for sustenance and commerce. Legends describing gods as keepers of wealth, knowledge, and celestial knowledge may preserve hints that these early inhabitants controlled resources and information flow, leaving a lasting imprint on human memory. Some scholars propose that these immortal cities may have functioned as hubs of innovation, where knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, and celestial observation was concentrated. Artistic depictions of radiant palaces, stairways to the heavens, and mountaintop temples echo practical knowledge of elevated architecture and defensive settlement, suggesting symbolic preservation of engineering achievements. Reliefs, frescoes, and carvings from multiple regions depict luminous structures with geometrical precision, often aligned with solar or stellar events. Such imagery may encode both technological skill and the ritualized perception of these sites as extraordinary spaces, inspiring myths of immortality and divine presence. The blending of practical engineering and symbolic storytelling may have ensured that memories of these settlements persisted long after the original builders vanished. In the enduring myths of endless life and prosperity, we may find the memory of resourceful, stable, and technologically sophisticated peoples. Legends often describe cities untouched by decay, famine, or war, reflecting settlements that were exceptionally well provisioned or fortified. These qualities, perceived through the lens of oral storytelling, may have been magnified over generations, transforming human settlements into divine cities in narrative imagination. Climate studies show that some of these regions enjoyed unusually stable conditions, which may have contributed to the perception of perpetual abundance and longevity. With the cities now veiled in legend, stories portray inhabitants who surpass ordinary humanity, guiding us toward the next question: who were they? The continuity between divine tools, advanced settlements, and now the suggestion of extraordinary inhabitants hints at a civilization whose knowledge, architecture, and organization exceeded that of surrounding peoples. Perhaps the immortals were humans who had mastered early technology, resource management, and defensive architecture in ways that inspired awe across generations. The stage is now set to explore not only the places these myths describe, but the beings who dwelled there, whose legacy may have shaped the foundations of human culture itself. Even the air above and the stones beneath these cities seem to whisper secrets, hinting that the story of humanity is inseparable from the memory of its first architects. Titans, giants, and the ancients before. Legends tell of titanic forms whose shadows stretched across the valleys of early civilizations, beings whose very presence inspired awe, reverence, and fear. In Norse sagas, the Jötnar loom as primal forces, massive and intelligent, often challenging the gods themselves, while Greek myths recount the Titans, ancestors of the Olympians, whose enormity and ingenuity reshaped the cosmos. Hebrew traditions recall the Nephilim, giants upon the earth, whose extraordinary stature and capabilities made them both revered and feared by ordinary humans. Across continents, these stories converge on a single theme. The first civilizations remembered not only the places they inhabited and the technologies they wielded, but also the beings whose physical and intellectual presence defined an era. Fossil evidence hints at human populations that exceeded typical stature, suggesting a tangible basis for these myths. Homo heidelbergensis, one of our early hominin cousins, reached heights and built structures that would have seemed imposing to contemporary Homo sapiens. The discovery of robust skeletal remains, such as those found in the Levant and Europe, indicates not just increased physical size, but a musculature adapted for strength-intensive labor, perhaps for construction, hunting, or defense. Denisovan fragments in Siberia and Tibet, while scant, imply genetic diversity and physiological variation in early human populations that may have inspired tales of extraordinary individuals. When early Homo sapiens encountered these robust contemporaries, the experience may have been remembered and magnified across generations, eventually merging into myth. In distant lands, stories emerge of beings whose skills with tools, architecture, and ceremony went beyond ordinary human reach. The sudden construction of megalithic monuments in Malta, Egypt, and Anatolia around the Neolithic period coincides with the mythic memory of giants or godlike figures who could move enormous stones with precision. In these stories, the giants are not only physical but also intellectual. They organize societies, impart knowledge, and perform feats that ordinary humans could not replicate. Could these tales be cultural echoes of individuals whose combined physicality and skill led observers to perceive them as divine, as architects of both society and legend? The Hebrew Nephilim, Greek Titans, and Norse Jotnar each encode narratives of extraordinary strength and influence, yet subtle patterns emerge. The Nephilim are often depicted as offspring of divine beings and humans, bridging a metaphysical gap while remaining grounded in material reality. Greek Titans are portrayed as progenitors, shaping the natural and social world, while the Jotnar frequently inhabit liminal spaces, mountains, forests, and icy realms, places where humans rarely tread, suggesting a symbolic connection between height, remoteness, and power. Each of these mythic traditions preserves the memory of beings whose impact was tangible, their presence intertwined with the rise of early civilization, whether through engineering, ritual, or social dominance. Archaeological layers sometimes reveal sudden bursts of megalithic activity, possibly linked to these remarkable figures. In Anatolia's Göbekli Tepe, colossal T-shaped pillars, many weighing multiple tons, were erected with precision before the advent of known metal tools. Malta's Al-Saflieni Hypogeum demonstrates subterranean engineering that surpasses the capabilities expected of small Neolithic communities. These feats align with mythic descriptions of giants performing superhuman construction tasks, suggesting that stories may encode historical memory. Individuals of exceptional size and intelligence could have led such monumental projects, leaving a legacy enshrined in stone. Genetic analyses provide further insight, suggesting pockets of unusually tall or robust hominins may have coexisted with early Homo sapiens. Variants influencing height and skeletal robustness appear in ancient DNA from scattered Eurasian populations, raising the possibility that the legends of giants reflect encounters with these subpopulations. Beyond stature, these groups may have possessed specialized knowledge, agriculture, metallurgy, or astronomy that distinguished them culturally and technologically, further reinforcing their elevation to godlike status in oral histories. The fusion of extraordinary physicality and knowledge likely produced figures remembered as both powerful and divine. Even the earliest written myths convey awe, fear, and respect for beings whose presence shaped human development. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero king's semi-divine stature reflects a cultural memory of individuals whose abilities bridged the mortal and the extraordinary. Similarly, Norse and Greek texts depict contests, mentorships, and conflicts between giants and gods, framing interactions in ways that emphasize influence, ingenuity, and ethical consequences. These narratives preserve not only memory of physical characteristics, but also societal roles, implying that early humans may have recognized exceptional members of their civilization as agents of transformation builders, teachers and rulers whose actions transcended ordinary life. Oral traditions, preserved across millennia, may reflect encounters with these individuals, blending fact and myth into enduring stories. The consistent motif of immense stature and extraordinary skill across continents and eras suggests a shared human response to exceptional humans rather than coincidental imagination. When these figures appear in myths, they are almost always involved in foundational acts, constructing cities, founding laws, teaching techniques, or combating chaos, underscoring their integral role in the first civilization's narrative and the subsequent oral record. The artifacts and ruins they left behind hint at a civilization with knowledge and capabilities beyond surrounding societies. Stone monuments, astronomical alignments, and ritual sites demonstrate a deliberate transmission of technical and symbolic knowledge, suggesting that the so-called giants may have been the keepers and disseminators of the first civilization's intellectual and cultural capital. In this view, myth becomes a vessel. It encodes memory, preserves reverence, and conceals practical knowledge in metaphorical form, ensuring that even as direct records fade, the imprint of these extraordinary beings persists. Yet, as environmental and social pressures shifted, the memory of these beings transformed into tales of gods and giants. Natural disasters, climate change, and societal upheaval may have obscured historical specifics, leaving narrative skeletons that human imagination completed with divine attributes. What survives are stories of strength, wisdom, and intervention attributes that would later be ascribed to gods shaping human destiny. Such transformations remind us that myths may simultaneously encode historical truth and creative embellishment, merging observation with imagination in ways that persist across millennia. From these giants, the narrative naturally moves toward the cataclysmic events, the floods that challenged even the gods themselves, suggesting that the same civilization capable of producing extraordinary beings was also vulnerable to the forces of nature and time. In contemplating these myths, the audience is invited to ask, if such beings once walked the earth, what lessons might their stories hold about survival, knowledge, and the fragile yet enduring imprint of a civilization that may have been lost to memory but never forgotten? The flood that ended the age of gods. During the rising waters, myths portray divine figures overseeing, directing, and occasionally punishing humans, their influence as integral to the tale as the flood itself. Across continents and millennia, civilizations preserved accounts of great deluges, often attributing them to divine intent, warning, or intervention. Sumerian texts speak of Utnapishtim, who, forewarned by the gods, constructed an ark to save his family and the seeds of life. In Greek lore, Deucalion and Pyrrha endure a cosmic flood with Zeus's guidance, preserving human continuity. The biblical Noah carries animals and knowledge of the world's order into a new era, while Chinese traditions recount the efforts of Gun and Yu to control the waters and restore the land. In these narratives, floods are not random. They are moments in which the extraordinary beings of intelligence, foresight, and power intervene, suggesting that the first civilization may have been both vulnerable and supremely capable in equal measure. Sedimentary layers and ancient shorelines provide stark evidence that some of these myths may contain kernels of truth. Geological studies indicate sudden inundations, including meltwater pulse 1b, a rapid rise in sea level between roughly 11,400 and 11,000 years ago, capable of flooding coastal settlements across the world. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis further suggests a catastrophic overflow that transformed an inland lake into a vast sea, potentially wiping out Neolithic communities and inspiring flood legends. Fossilized coastal settlements, submerged peat beds, and tsunami deposits hint at human encounters with events of immense scale. Even isolated communities may have experienced local but devastating floods, which, when shared through oral tradition, could converge into the global flood motifs seen across disparate cultures. Could the architects of civilization, the beings later remembered as gods, have anticipated these crises and acted to preserve life and knowledge? The myths imply that they did, spanning Mesopotamia, Greece, China, and the Americas. These flood myths converge in striking thematic patterns. Arks, boats, or mountain refuges appear in virtually every major tradition, and many recount a single family, priest, or sage as a survivor. This convergence raises questions about human memory, transmission, and observation. Were these merely symbolic stories about divine wrath, or are they echoes of a prehistoric civilization whose leaders understood hydrology, engineering, and the need for preservation? Selective survival, the choice of who and what would endure, suggests agency. The flood myths cast these first civilization figures as both enforcers and saviors, blending judgment with foresight and transforming catastrophe into continuity. Genetic studies reveal evidence consistent with catastrophic bottlenecks in human populations around the end of the last ice age. Certain lineages sharply declined, while others, particularly in refugia and higher ground settlements, persisted and spread. Archaeology shows that after some sudden floods, human groups rapidly rebuilt settlements, sometimes with marked technological innovation, including advanced ceramics, water management, and megalithic construction. Could these bursts of activity reflect the direction or instruction of the extraordinary survivors described in myth? In cultures that deified leaders or sages, the timing and scope of post-flood innovations may have been remembered as divine wisdom, embedding historical events into stories of godlike intervention. Symbolism in flood myths often encodes practical lessons. The ark, the mountain, the preserved seeds, and the careful cataloguing of life hint at ecological understanding. Some myths emphasize the retention of knowledge songs, sacred texts, or ritual practices, suggesting that the gods were not only protecting life, but also safeguarding culture. In the Sumerian Atrahasis, the flood brings selective destruction to control population, while Noah's Ark ensures continuity. Both narratives reflect ethical and logistical thought, implying awareness of social and environmental systems. Even in Greek and Chinese accounts, divine figures advise humans on survival and reconstruction, bridging the mythical and practical realms. These stories may represent encoded strategies for enduring catastrophe, attributed to beings whose abilities exceeded those of ordinary humans. Connections uncovered by archaeology add further weight to the speculation. Submerged Neolithic villages, raised mounds, and rapid shifts in settlement patterns coincide with the timing of global or regional deluges. These events align with the mythic emphasis on divine guidance and selection, suggesting that the first civilization leaders, or their mythic descendants, may have orchestrated evacuations, resource storage, and post-flood reconstruction. Across cultures, the selective survival of particular individuals, families, or clans mirrors the mythic pattern. A few exceptional beings endure, preserving the wisdom and technology necessary to restart society. Perhaps the floods were not merely natural phenomena, but pivotal tests of the civilization's ability to survive, remembered and magnified in myth as acts of godlike foresight. Oral traditions amplified these events, framing survivors as semi-divine or extraordinary. By attributing floods to gods or advanced beings, cultures encoded both awe and instruction. The universality of flood stories, ark construction, preservation of life, sacred mountains, and divine guidance suggests a collective memory of disasters that left a profound imprint on human cognition. The myths convey not only catastrophe but also resilience, emphasizing the role of knowledge, skill, and leadership in averting total annihilation. From this perspective, the first civilization's influence may extend beyond architecture or technology, embedding itself into the very narrative structure of human myth, where survival itself becomes legendary. Beyond tales of mere endurance, these stories encode the memory of intervention alongside survival. In every story, extraordinary beings, those who would be remembered as gods, act with intent, demonstrating understanding, authority, and strategy. Floods become a stage on which human and divine ingenuity intersect, allowing knowledge to flow from one era to the next. From Mesopotamian river valleys to highland refuges, myths capture a moment when civilization itself teetered on the brink, saved by those whose stature, wisdom, or power exceeded that of ordinary humans. And as the last waves of these deluges subside, the imagination is drawn toward the survivors, the godlike figures who carried knowledge, craft, and ritual into the next age, hinting that the next chapter of our story will explore the wandering sages, culture bringers, and mysterious teachers who emerged from the flood shadow, continuing the legacy of the first civilization. After the deluge, survivors in the shadows. Amid the water's withdrawal, renewal began under the guidance of figures whose abilities seemed extraordinary. Across continents, myths recount beings who appeared at the precise moment societies teetered on collapse, offering tools, knowledge, and ritual guidance that enabled survival. These figures, later remembered as demigods or emissaries, may represent cultural memory of the first civilization's survivors, humans, whose extraordinary abilities, technological insight, or ritual mastery distinguished them from ordinary populations. In examining these stories through a speculative lens, we begin to see the flood not as the end of civilization, but as a crucible in which knowledge was tested, preserved, and transmitted through individuals who straddled the line between human and divine. In the Babylonian lowlands, Oannes rose from the depths, instructing humans in writing, agriculture, and ritual. Ancient texts describe him emerging from the waters, his body part fish, part human, carrying clay tablets and teachings for a society newly confronted with survival challenges. Modern archaeological interpretation suggests these tales could reflect encounters with a surviving class of knowledgeable individuals, engineers, planners, and teachers whose capabilities were mythologized over generations. By embedding their actions in fantastical imagery, early storytellers ensured that the lessons and practical knowledge endured, codified within a narrative that both awed and instructed. High in the Andes, Viracocha's travels inspired creation myths, teaching civilization building techniques to scattered communities. Legends describe him walking across barren landscapes, shaping lakes and mountains, and instructing humans in the arts of agriculture, architecture, and astronomy. These narratives may encode collective memory of post-catastrophe reconstruction led by extraordinary survivors whose guidance accelerated the rise of complex societies in regions devastated by environmental change. By framing them as a godlike teacher, successive generations preserved knowledge in a way that was easily transmitted orally across shifting cultures and landscapes. From the Far East, Panku's remnant sages shaped rivers, leveled fields, and imparted calendrical knowledge essential for survival. In these myths, post-flood humanity is depicted as fragile, unformed, or disoriented, while the sages provide structure, measurement, and ritual frameworks that allow societies to thrive once more. Anthropological analysis of early Chinese settlements reveals sudden advancements in irrigation, metallurgy, and ritual practice shortly after flood layers, suggesting that a concentrated knowledge source may have seeded recovery. Such accounts, framed mythically, preserve the memory of deliberate transmission of expertise, painting a picture of gods not merely as divine arbiters, but as educators and guides. Evidence within post-flood settlements shows sudden technological leaps coinciding with disaster layers, hinting at the presence of skilled intermediaries influencing reconstruction. Across Mesopotamia, the stratigraphy of sites like Uruk and Eridu suggests rapid rebuilding after inundation events, with architectural, agricultural, and craft improvements emerging in remarkably compressed timelines. These material traces correlate with mythic accounts of beings who carried knowledge from pre-deluge civilizations, implying that legends of divine teachers may encode historical memory of a human-led recovery effort amplified into myth. Patterns in art, architecture, and ritual indicate deliberate preservation of knowledge by these extraordinary figures. From symbolic motifs on pottery to the construction of ritual centers, certain design choices appear consistent across disparate regions, hinting at shared techniques and principles inherited from a vanished civilization. By encoding functional knowledge in sacred and artistic forms, these survivors could maintain continuity of technical and cultural wisdom, even as environmental chaos reshaped the physical world. Embedded in legend, practical and moral lessons endure, their divine framing safeguarding them across generations. Tales of obedience, ingenuity, and strategic decision-making in post-flood myths suggest that the first civilization's ideals were deliberately transmitted alongside practical skills. Mythic embellishment reinforced memory, giving instructions a layer of authority and permanence that ordinary oral teaching might lack. Consequently, knowledge was not only preserved, but elevated, entwining human learning with the divine in ways that left an indelible imprint on cultural consciousness. Mythical accounts dispersed across continents, suggesting networks of knowledge transmission that survived environmental collapse. Similarities between Oannes, Viracocha, and Panku myths indicate either diffusion of survivors' teachings or convergent narrative coding of analogous post-disaster experiences. By analysing these legends comparatively, we glimpse the possibility of a connected system of knowledge bearers whose influence transcended geography, preserving the first civilization's innovations in a form accessible to future generations. In the collective memory of early civilizations, meetings with survivors became mythologized, rendering emissaries as semi-divine teachers. Whether due to awe, exaggeration, or the necessity of legitimizing authority, communities depicted these figures as gods, attributing feats of wisdom and power that extended beyond ordinary human capability. Such myths offer clues to the way memory of extraordinary individuals becomes entwined with sacred narrative, especially when their contributions fundamentally shaped societal survival and advancement. Traces of instruction embedded in daily life link the memory of these beings to the foundations of emerging civilizations. Ritual calendars, agricultural techniques, water management systems, and architectural patterns persist long after the floods themselves are forgotten. Each subtle continuation of practice hints at a structured transmission of knowledge, reinforcing the idea that myths of post-deluge gods may preserve historical memory of individuals whose interventions were both practical and transformative. Even after they disappeared from the historical record, their influence persisted, embedding the first civilization's wisdom in mythic form. From ceremonial centers to local legend, the actions of these post-flood figures were perpetuated in stories, rituals, and symbols, forming the connective tissue between a vanished society and its successors. Myths thus functioned as repositories of knowledge, encoding the survival strategies, technological insights, and moral frameworks essential for rebuilding civilization in a world reshaped by catastrophe. Following the departure of these divine figures, the relics and symbols they left endured as vessels of knowledge, setting the stage for the journey ahead. Across continents, enigmatic objects, carvings, and ceremonial sites hint at lessons meant to survive both time and memory. These remnants, coupled with oral traditions, suggest that the first civilization's influence lingered not only through the grand acts of its godlike members, but through the subtle persistence of encoded knowledge, leading naturally into the myths that speak in symbols, signs, and sacred motifs, the next phase of discovery in our exploration of humanity's first gods, the language of symbols. From the shadows of post-flood survivors, a pattern begins to emerge in the carved and painted images left behind, as though these godlike figures deliberately encoded messages meant to endure beyond human lifespans. Across the arid plains of Nabta Playa, serpentine motifs twist through stone circles, echoing similar coils etched into the cliffs of Göbekli Tepe, separated by thousands of miles and millennia. Spirals radiate in petroglyphs from the Orkney Islands to Mesoamerica, their forms appearing almost as universal markers of sacred cycles, time, or cosmic order, suggesting that these images were more than decoration, they were instruments of memory. Sun disks and radiating rays dominate temple walls and altars from Egypt to Anatolia, their precise alignments indicating careful observation of celestial phenomena, hinting that knowledge of solstices, equinoxes, and seasonal patterns was being encoded into symbolic language. Winged beings emerge on murals in the Andes, in Mesopotamian cylinder seals, and on Bronze Age Aegean frescoes, their forms consistently associated with authority, protection, or divine transmission, implying that these images served as mnemonic devices for governance, ritual, or societal guidance. Comparative study of sites across continents reveals striking similarities in geometric construction, thematic recurrence, and motif placement, suggesting a shared semiotic system. At Göbekli Tepe, for example, carved snakes intertwine with abstract emblems, while at the sunken temples of Malta, spirals and concentric circles dominate stone reliefs. In the Americas, feathered serpent figures occupy ceremonial centers, linking myth, astronomy, and social order. Such parallels raise a tantalizing possibility. Could these motifs represent a deliberate transmission of technical, cosmological, and societal knowledge from the first civilization's godlike survivors? Material analysis underscores the intentionality of these symbols. Pigments derived from minerals, ochres, and rare clays were sourced and processed with skill. Carving techniques required precision and foresight, reflecting a cognitive depth beyond mere artistic expression. The labour-intensive nature of production implies purpose. These were not casual markings, but deliberate vessels of information, each layer of abstraction designed to endure centuries, perhaps millennia, as durable repositories of collective memory. Artifacts reveal further complexity. The same symbols recur across portable items, pottery, jewellery, and ceremonial tools, linking everyday life to sacred knowledge. Spirals found on Neolithic ceramics in Europe mirror those on Andean ritual stones. Winged beings appear on votive objects, as well as monumental reliefs. This dual presence indicates that encoding was intended for both elite ritual and communal awareness, a system reinforcing societal cohesion and transmitting cosmological principles through repeated, recognizable forms. Cognitive archaeology provides insight into the mental frameworks behind these symbols. The recurrence of spirals, serpents, and celestial discs suggests that humans, guided or instructed by the godlike figures of the first civilization, had developed symbolic conventions capable of encoding abstract knowledge about time, natural cycles, and social order. The consistency of motifs across vast distances and independent cultures implies either deliberate diffusion by these advanced beings or a universal human receptivity shaped by the memory of extraordinary predecessors. Cross-referencing myth with iconography further illuminates their significance. In Mesopotamian texts, serpents symbolize wisdom and divine protection. In Mesoamerican myth, feathered serpents guide agricultural cycles and celestial knowledge. In Celtic and Aegean traditions, spirals are linked to life, death, and cosmic continuity. Taken together, these symbolic threads may preserve a latent memory of the first civilization's gods, encoding lessons in morality, science, and ritual that survived even as direct knowledge of the individuals faded. Even the spatial arrangement of symbols reflects a sophisticated understanding of environment and perception. Petroglyphs oriented to solar paths, temple reliefs aligned with cardinal points, and motifs repeated along processional avenues demonstrate a conscious effort to integrate symbolic knowledge with landscape and architecture. Such integration may indicate that these symbols functioned as a living network of information, bridging geography and time, embedding the memory of the first civilization into both matter and mind. The persistence of these symbols across generations raises compelling questions. What knowledge was encoded, and why was it preserved so widely? Perhaps the first civilization's survivors sought to ensure continuity of societal, technological, or astronomical understanding, leaving visual breadcrumbs that would guide future humans toward rediscovering principles once mastered by beings now remembered as gods. Their symbolic language may have been an attempt to inscribe lessons directly onto the fabric of human perception, ensuring that even as floods, migrations, and cultural collapses intervened, the memory of divine instruction would endure. As these symbols endure across continents and epochs, they naturally lead us to the monumental structures that may have amplified their meaning, preserved their lessons in stone, and codified the gods' knowledge for the generations that followed. Temples, megaliths, and ceremonial complexes were not only sites of ritual, but also repositories of encoded instruction designed to teach, inspire, and transmit memory over centuries. In tracing the continuity of symbols, from portable objects to massive architecture, we glimpse the enduring imprint of a civilization whose godlike figures consciously shaped human history, leaving behind a visual and conceptual legacy that bridges the mortal and the divine. From the subtle persistence of symbols, the story naturally ascends into the monumental, the colossal stone structures, temples, and megalithic complexes that seem to echo the very messages encoded by the gods themselves, preserving knowledge in ways that transcend mere human memory and connecting humanity to the first civilization's enduring legacy. Stones that remember. Set into the land, these stones follow the heavens, aligning with celestial cycles in a harmony that suggests cosmic awareness. Across the Maltese archipelago, the temples of Aja, Khiam, and Nadra demonstrate remarkable precision. Massive limestone blocks, some weighing tens of tons, are positioned to mark solstices with uncanny accuracy, reflecting a knowledge of celestial mechanics that surpasses what one might expect of Neolithic societies. Each megalith seems less like a mere construction and more like a page in a monumental manuscript, intended to communicate across generations, encoding observations, rituals, and the very rhythm of the cosmos. In these structures, the gods, if they were indeed historical actors, appear as architects who deliberately merged practical engineering with symbolic intent, leaving humanity an enduring inheritance of knowledge. Within the granite of Malta and the limestone of Yonaguni, Japan, we find echoes of a civilization that may have deliberately inscribed its presence into the earth itself. Underwater terraces and monolithic steps at Yonaguni, aligned with astronomical markers, suggest an understanding of both geometry and seasonal cycles that challenges conventional timelines for advanced prehistoric engineering. On the surface, such sites have been dismissed as natural formations, yet careful measurements, tool marks, and the repetitive precision of structures hint at deliberate human or godlike construction. What these monuments share is a sense of purpose: to preserve memory, to convey understanding, and perhaps to record the influence of extraordinary beings whose intellect or power was remembered as divine. Each pillar, each carefully positioned block, hints at an intelligence that transcended ordinary construction techniques. At Stonehenge, the sarsen stones, weighing up to 25 tons, were transported from quarries more than 20 miles away, then erected in precise geometric patterns that align with solstices. Similarly, the Nabta Playa complex in the Nubian desert predates Stonehenge by millennia, demonstrating astronomical orientation, stone circles, and burial alignments that suggest both ritual significance and sophisticated spatial cognition. In imagining the builders, we are drawn to consider whether mythic figures the gods were remembered not only for their wisdom, but for the tangible monuments they created to teach, observe, and preserve knowledge. The monumental nature of these stones transforms them into enduring textbooks, each one a lesson in astronomy, mathematics, and ritual practice. Threads of geometry, orientation, and ritual weave a subtle connection between cultures from Europe to the Americas and Asia. In the Americas, the geometric precision of Cahokia's mounds and the astronomical alignments at Chaco Canyon echo the principles seen in Eurasian megaliths, raising the provocative question: could these similarities represent shared knowledge originating from a first civilization, or even a single lineage of godlike figures who disseminated their wisdom? From spiral carvings and serpent motifs to alignment with stellar movements, the recurring principles suggest more than coincidence. They imply a universal methodology of encoding knowledge, a symbolic language made manifest in stone, bridging cultures separated by oceans, yet connected in their reverence for monumental instruction. The monumental scale of these complexes transforms symbolic instruction into a landscape, making knowledge visible from miles away. Visitors approaching Menajdra, or the megalithic temples of Malta, would have encountered spaces that were both functional and mnemonic. Corridors guiding movement in concert with ceremonial observation, openings framing the sun's path at specific times of year, and spatial relationships designed to preserve understanding of cosmology. Here, architecture and pedagogy merge. The builder's intention seems clear: to craft environments that would survive millennia, transmitting wisdom long after the original teacher's mythic or historical gods had vanished. In every stone, a message endures, a bridge between the living, the dead, and the remembered divine. In examining construction techniques, from precise stone cutting to massive transport methods, we glimpse the practical genius behind the sacred designs. Quarrying, levering, and placement required not only coordination but also empirical understanding of weight, balance, and materials, knowledge that, if encoded in myth, could explain tales of the gods' superior abilities. Perhaps stories of deities wielding unimaginable strength or performing feats beyond human capability are collective memories of those who orchestrated these extraordinary building projects. The stones themselves, silent yet insistent, act as historical witnesses to the capabilities of a civilization whose leaders, divine or semi-divine, blur the line between myth and memory. Even the placement of ceremonial chambers suggests that these were not merely buildings, but interactive memory systems designed to teach, inspire, and endure. At Göbekli Tepe, for instance, concentric stone enclosures carved with animals, celestial symbols, and abstract motifs may have functioned as repositories of accumulated knowledge, a sacred library for a civilization still emerging from prehistory. In this light, the gods' influence is tangible, not just conceptual. They designed not only objects of worship, but entire environments in which knowledge could be accessed, ritualized, and perpetuated. Every carefully aligned stone, every carved motif, every spatial orientation becomes a deliberate act of legacy preservation, a conscious bridge between divine intention and human comprehension. Carved into the stones, a tale of continuity, foresight, and divine influence stretches across millennia, hinting at the bloodlines destined to inherit this legacy. By inscribing knowledge into stone, the first civilization may have ensured that its culture, science, and sacred teachings survived both natural disasters and the erosion of oral memory. Observing these monuments today, one is struck not only by their aesthetic grandeur, but by the suggestion that they are deliberate repositories, memory architecture designed by figures whose wisdom was encoded as tangible evidence, blending human capability with what later generations remembered as divine mastery. The connection between symbol, monument, and myth becomes unmistakable, guiding the imagination toward those who carried these legacies forward. The semi-divine lineages, the descendants of these architects, whose actions shaped both history and legend. From monumental memory, the narrative now focuses on divine bloodlines descending from these godlike founders, suggesting that the gods' knowledge, intent, and enduring presence were not just etched in stone, but inherited through families, dynasties, and lineages, bridging the material and mythic worlds in ways that continue to echo through history. Blood of the sky, the divine lineages. Beneath the quiet watch of temples and monuments, attention shifts toward the living heirs of divine knowledge, whose bloodlines carried forward the intent of godlike architects. Across civilizations, tales of rulers born of gods suggest that extraordinary ability was remembered as a divine mandate, a bridge between myth and history. Pharaohs who claimed descent from Ra, kings chronicled in the Sumerian king list with impossibly long reigns, and Inca rulers regarded as the sons of Inti all hint at a continuity of exceptional leadership intertwined with divine attribution. These stories may preserve the memory of individuals whose intellect, organizational skill, or technological insight set them apart, and whose influence was so profound that it was remembered as supernatural. Monuments and rites tell a story in which leaders are more than political figures. They are divine incarnations. The alignment of pyramids, ziggurats, and palaces often mirrors celestial patterns, suggesting that rulers were consciously tied to the cosmos in both myth and administration. The deliberate intertwining of governance, ritual, and architecture implies an inheritance of knowledge originally bestowed by the first civilization's advanced figures, whose memory persisted through dynastic lines. In this way, kings and queens became living vessels of a tradition that blended practical mastery with the awe-inspiring qualities of divine beings. In examining royal genealogies, longevity records, and extraordinary achievements, patterns emerge that hint at inherited wisdom or structured education. Elite families often preserved skills, rituals, and knowledge inaccessible to the general population, cultivating specialists in astronomy, engineering, or administration who could maintain societal stability across generations. These practices, repeated across continents and millennia, suggest that mythic claims of divine ancestry were not only symbolic, but may encode historical truths about the transmission of advanced knowledge and influence. The first civilization's principles, innovation, order, and ritualized governance could have been carefully safeguarded within these lineages, ensuring continuity even as the wider world evolved. Artifacts, inscriptions, and royal burial practices reinforce the connection between mythic ancestry and historical authority. In Egypt, pharaonic mummies were adorned with regalia representing celestial and divine symbolism. In Mesopotamia, cylinder seals recorded acts of kings whose narratives blended historical events with mythic context. In the Andes, elaborate tombs preserved both objects and stories, suggesting intentional preservation of power and legacy. Such material evidence underscores the possibility that dynastic rulers consciously maintained a heritage derived from godlike predecessors, linking the extraordinary achievements of their societies to the memory of beings whose capabilities were once beyond ordinary human comprehension. Even as civilizations evolved, myths of divine parentage persisted, shaping governance, religion, and social hierarchy in ways that linked rulers to their mythic predecessors. The perpetuation of sacred bloodlines reinforced societal cohesion, justified political authority, and maintained continuity in religious practice. Leaders were more than administrators. They were ritual performers, guardians of knowledge, and living reminders of the first civilization's legacy. By embedding divine narrative within dynastic continuity, these lineages acted as both memory keepers and myth makers, bridging the gap between past and present, legend and lived experience. Through the lens of anthropology and genetic studies, patterns of elite inheritance suggest mechanisms for preserving specialized knowledge over generations. Endogamous practices, mentorship structures, and ritual initiation may have ensured that the wisdom and skills associated with divine figures did not dissipate with time. Anthropologists note that societies with complex hierarchies often institutionalize knowledge transmission to protect cultural and technological advancements, a principle consistent with myths of semi-divine rulers who appeared to guide and shape their populations. These findings support the notion that extraordinary lineages in myth and history could reflect tangible strategies for knowledge preservation initiated by the first civilization. Inscriptions, manuscripts, and oral tales reveal that divine lineages are often at the heart of monumental feats. From architectural wonders to innovative governance, legendary rulers are credited with feats that align with the evidence left behind. The planning of cities, the orchestration of irrigation systems, and the codification of law and ritual. While myth amplifies their abilities, the underlying pattern suggests that human actors, descendants or disciples of godlike figures, implemented knowledge originally conceived by an earlier advanced society. The echoes of these figures persist not as fantasy alone, but as encoded historical memory, waiting to be deciphered by those who look for the traces of civilization's formative architects. Even the most symbolic myths carry fingerprints of potential historical reality. The attribution of divine ancestry may have been a means to legitimize authority, but it simultaneously immortalized the extraordinary accomplishments of these rulers. In connecting the semi-divine to the societal achievements, a narrative emerges. The first civilization's influence survived not only in stone, tools, or written records, but in blood, memory, and governance. Such continuity suggests that human societies were guided by the enduring imprint of beings who were extraordinary, whether in stature, intellect, or ritual mastery, and whose deeds inspired legends that would shape collective consciousness for millennia. By the final dynastic inscriptions, the echoes of the first civilization resonate through ceremonial rites, temple hierarchies, and royal iconography, revealing a deliberate effort to encode divine legacy within tangible and social frameworks. The god's presence was thus both a narrative and structural reality, manifested in families who inherited knowledge, power, and ritual responsibility. Each lineage becomes a living monument, a vessel for cultural memory, ensuring that the wisdom of extraordinary predecessors can outlast political upheavals and environmental catastrophes. As divine bloodlines fade into myth, the stories gradually transition into rituals, festivals, and localized legends, creating a web of memory that preserves fragments of the first civilization's influence, even as direct understanding diminishes. In tracing these lineages, the imagination is drawn to the mechanisms by which humans remember gods, through governance, through ceremony, through inheritance of both tangible and intangible legacies. The narrative now stands at the threshold where myths themselves, once grounded in extraordinary individuals, transform into cultural practices, festivals, and stories that outlive direct memory. These inherited rituals carry encoded lessons and values, a final echo of the first civilization's architects, whispering across time that the god's presence was not merely spiritual but historically embedded. As the divine fades from bloodline into legend, humanity is left with the living traces of memory, signaling the next chapter in which myths themselves become the enduring vessels of history and culture, echoes of the forgotten gods. In the millennia following the decline of divine dynasties, the memory of extraordinary beings persisted, not merely in stone or story, but in the living practices of human communities who unknowingly preserved fragments of a vanished civilization. Rituals, festivals, and initiatory ceremonies carried lessons encoded in gesture, chant, and repetition, embedding wisdom that had once been taught by those whose abilities surpassed ordinary human capacity. Even when the temples crumbled or dynasties fell, these practices endured, a quiet but persistent transmission of knowledge that outlasted both ruler and structure. Across continents, from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the highlands of Mesoamerica, enigmatic rites reveal patterns of continuity stretching centuries, hinting at a civilization whose memory was woven into the very fabric of human behavior. Hidden in the cadence of festival cycles, the repetition of sacred acts became a vessel for both instruction and devotion. Initiates performed gestures that mirrored cosmological arrangements, invoked deities who may have been historical figures, and recited phrases whose meanings were layered with encoded knowledge. Seasonal celebrations, often tied to celestial alignments, preserved awareness of time, natural cycles, and ecological observation, suggesting that even the simplest of human acts could carry the imprint of extraordinary insight. Each firelit procession, water purification ritual, or ritualized dance was more than tradition. It was a coded map connecting humans to a time when the gods walked among them, teaching, guiding, and overseeing the development of civilization. Woven into distant traditions, subtle commonalities link disparate cultures, revealing echoes of a shared origin. Spiral motifs in Celtic art, feathered serpents in Mesoamerica, sun discs in Egypt, and winged creatures in Mesopotamia may all carry symbolic lessons originating from the first civilization's architects. These symbols, repeated across millennia, suggest deliberate encoding of information, ethical frameworks, or cosmological understanding. Their persistence implies a conscious effort to maintain memory, even as the names, faces, and structures of the gods faded from living memory. Anthropologists and cognitive archaeologists observe that such repetition reinforces communal knowledge, ensuring that wisdom can survive catastrophic loss and socio-political upheaval. Within the cadence of festivals, hidden structures of cognition emerge, revealing a sophisticated approach to human learning. Songs, chants, and theatrical reenactments often dramatized moral choices, leadership qualities, or technological accomplishments, offering an embodied curriculum of ancestral expertise. These practices preserved the legacy of extraordinary beings whose feats had inspired awe, ensuring that the principles of the first civilization continued to influence social organization, morality, and understanding of the natural world. Across temples, shrines, and sacred groves, the echoes of these divine teachers were carefully choreographed into the collective consciousness, transforming myth into actionable knowledge. Through prophetic visions, ritualized instruction, and initiatory practices, humanity received guidance from figures whose memory had long since transcended mortality. Mesopotamian seers, Greek oracles, Chinese diviners, and Mesoamerican priest kings may have functioned as conduits for this encoded wisdom, transmitting insights that were simultaneously practical, symbolic, and spiritual. These individuals bridged the gap between ordinary humans and the extraordinary beings remembered as gods, translating lost knowledge into forms accessible to emerging societies. Their work preserved techniques, agricultural practices, astronomical observation, and social organization, subtly shaping civilizations in ways that are only now visible through comparative study. Even in remote shrines and sanctuaries, the repetition of gestures, chants, and offerings reflects a conscious effort to encode and perpetuate understanding. Small actions, pouring water in precise rituals, carving specific symbols, or arranging ceremonial objects, acted as mnemonic devices, preserving the memory of knowledge otherwise vulnerable to disappearance. These acts, repeated across generations, demonstrate how cultural memory can endure without direct textual transmission, embedding lessons within human habit and communal experience. In this way, the first civilization's influence continued quietly but persistently, a hidden current beneath the surface of ordinary life. Amid seasonal ceremonies and calendrical observances, subtle threads connect distant cultures, suggesting the footprint of godlike architects whose legacies were not solely mythic. Alignments of sacred spaces with solstices, equinoxes, or lunar cycles appear globally, hinting at a shared understanding of astronomy and timekeeping. Agricultural festivals, harvest rites, and celestial observations were not random traditions. They were echoes of applied knowledge, from a civilization whose inhabitants had once manipulated both landscape and sky with remarkable sophistication. The surviving rituals may thus represent a dual purpose: reverence for extraordinary beings and the practical preservation of technological and scientific understanding. By examining prophetic visions, initiatory traditions, and symbolic gestures, we glimpse the persistence of encoded knowledge. Each festival, each ceremonial act carries layers of meaning, blending ethical guidance, cosmological awareness, and historical memory into a living practice. These are not mere superstitions. They are vessels deliberately crafted to survive the erosion of direct memory, enabling the wisdom of extraordinary beings to shape societies long after their physical presence vanished. From these enduring practices, it becomes clear that myths, rituals, and symbols are interconnected, forming a network that allowed humanity to inherit lessons from those who may have been remembered as gods, but were first and foremost teachers, engineers, and guides. Each recurring chant, each carefully orchestrated performance, is an invitation to perceive the invisible scaffolding of a lost civilization. Patterns of movement, sound, and symbol encode an awareness of morality, governance, and technological insight that surpasses ordinary human capability. By following these echoes across continents and centuries, we uncover a map of human cultural evolution, revealing that the first civilization's influence was not destroyed but instead carefully woven into the behaviors, celebrations, and consciousness of generations that followed. These whispers of the past demand reflection on how much of human ingenuity, knowledge, and ethical framework might originate in encounters with beings who were once perceived as gods. Ultimately, the persistence of these cultural echoes illuminates a path between myth and memory, showing how human societies retained fragments of extraordinary history even when written records failed. Festivals, rites, and ritualized performances encode both lessons and reverence, bridging the gap between mortal and divine, between vanished civilizations and living cultures. From the subtle persistence of symbols, gestures, and festivals, the story naturally ascends into the monumental, the temples, megaliths, and complex structures that record the god's influence in enduring stone, preparing us to explore the next chapter of humanity's encounter with divinity and the material legacy of the first civilization. The echoes of gods linger in stone, in ritual, in story remnants of a civilization whose memory shaped humanity's imagination long before written history. In tracing their shadows, we glimpse the possibility that myths were not mere fiction, but windows into a world of extraordinary beings, knowledge, and lost cities. Time may have buried them, yet their influence still hums beneath our feet and in the rhythms of our culture, urging us to look deeper, to question, to wonder. If the gods once walked among us, their footprints remain waiting for those who dare to follow. Subscribe to explore more mysteries, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share in the adventure of uncovering humanity's hidden past.